I'm sitting outside the intensive care unit on a cold plastic chair, watching my daughter-in-law push through the double doors. She'd been married to my son for 10 years. He was only 42, and he'd just been pronounced dead after a sudden massive cardiac event. A typical grieving widow would be shattered, unable to even stand. But Monica walked straight toward me, her designer heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. She looked entirely composed, not a hair out of place, her mascara perfectly intact. She leaned in, her face just inches from mine, completely ignoring the tears running down my cheeks. She whispered, "Richard, don't even think about getting a single cent of Colin's $50 million estate. It's all mine. Leave now, or I'll have security drag you out of this building." If you've just stumbled upon this story, take a deep breath. Because the truth I uncovered in the hours after my son passed completely changed everything I thought I knew about the woman he married. If you've ever been underestimated by people who mistook your silence for weakness, hit that like button. Tell me in the comments where and when you're watching this, so this old engineer knows who is listening. I'm 70 years old. I spent 40 years as a chief structural engineer, building bridges and corporate skyscrapers all over the country. I'm a man who understands how things are built, how stress points function, and how structures collapse. I retired a few years ago to live a quiet life here in Charlotte, North Carolina. My son Colin was my pride and joy. He took my engineering mindset and applied it to software, building a logistics tech company that exploded in value, $50 million. Financial analysts called him brilliant, generous, and dedicated. But when it came to Monica, he was completely blind. The fluorescent lights in the hospital hallway hummed with an irritating low-frequency buzz. I had been through 4 hours of agonizing waiting, 4 hours of watching doctors come and go, listening to the monitors beep in that frantic, heartbreaking rhythm. Colin was a runner, ate clean, didn't smoke, and had regular physicals. A healthy 42-year-old man suffering a catastrophic cardiac event just didn't make medical sense. When they finally turned off the machines and a doctor gave me a slow, heavy shake of his head, a part of my soul died with him. I felt numb and heavy, staring at my own calloused hands. These hands had drawn blueprints for massive steel structures, but they were completely powerless to save my only child. Then Monica stepped out of the private consulting room. I looked up, expecting to see a woman broken by grief, someone looking for a shoulder to cry on. Instead, I saw a predator who had just finished a very satisfying meal. She adjusted the cuffs of her pristine white blazer. Her hands weren't shaking and her eyes were not red. Her makeup wasn't just flawless. It had clearly been touched up. While her husband was dying on an operating table, she had actually taken the time to reapply her lipstick and powder in the hospital restroom. She walked toward me with a chilling, clear sense of purpose. "Colin is gone," she stated flatly. "Not passed away, not left us, just gone." It was as if she were reporting a misplaced package. I stood up slowly on aching joints, trying to push aside our differences and find words to comfort her. "Monica, I am so—" I started, but she cut me off, crowding into my personal space. The scent of her expensive floral perfume was nauseating in that sterile hallway. Then she said the words that still ring in my ears, warning me not to try and get a scent, threatening me with security. Any other father might have roared. Any other man might have caused a scene right there in the hospital corridor. But I didn't. My engineering brain, trained to observe, calculate, and analyze under extreme pressure, immediately went to work. I looked into her eyes. They were cold, dry, and filled with a hair-raising sense of triumph. There was no grief there, only calculation. What kind of reaction did she want from me? She wanted me to look out of control, angry and irrational, so she would have a justification to call security and paint me as a deranged, grieving father. So I gave her nothing. I just nodded slowly, met her cold stare, and took a step back. "I'll see you at the funeral, Monica," I said calmly, stripping my voice of the crushing grief that was tearing my chest apart. She let out a scoff, clearly disappointed that I hadn't taken the bait. She turned on her heel and strode down the long hallway, not even looking back once. I stood alone in the hall, letting the heavy, suffocating silence wash over me. A few minutes later, a young, exhausted-looking nurse approached me. She had a kind, compassionate face and a genuineness in her eyes that Monica completely lacked. "Mr. Caldwell?" she asked softly. I nodded. "I am so sorry for your loss. The doctors did everything they could." His heart just suddenly stopped. She glanced down at her clipboard, hesitating for less than a second, as if she wanted to say more, but she held back. She handed me a clear plastic bag of belongings. Inside were the clothes Colin had been wearing when the paramedics brought him in. His gray trousers, blue shirt, leather belt, and some personal items from his pockets. "These are his things," she said quietly. I took the bag, the thick plastic making a harsh scratching sound in the quiet hall. I thanked her in a voice I could barely hear, then walked out of the hospital. The automatic doors slid open, and the humid, heavy North Carolina air hit me like a wall. On such a dark day, the bright afternoon sun felt like an insult. I crossed the massive asphalt parking lot to my old but reliable car. I sat in the driver's seat, pulled the doors shut, and blocked out the city traffic noise. The reality of Colin's death finally pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, taking slow, rhythmic breaths to keep my hands from shaking. I allowed myself 2 full minutes to cry for my child. It was 2 minutes of dizzying, soul-crushing pain. But I couldn't get Monica's face out of my mind. That lack of shock, the immediate turn toward money, the freshly applied lipstick. This wasn't right. There was a serious problem with the foundation of this situation. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the bag of Colin's belongings. I opened the seal and pulled out his leather wallet, silver watch, and keys. Colin was a man of strict routine, almost obsessively detail-oriented. His life was very organized. As I rummaged through his heavy keychain, something immediately caught my eye. Tucked tightly between his car key and his house key was a strange, unmarked brass key. It looked old and had an industrial weight to it, exactly like a high-security safe deposit box key. In our weekly calls, Colin had never mentioned opening a separate safety deposit box. I placed the key on the dashboard and reached back into the bag. Deep in the front pocket of the folded gray trousers was a crumpled, small, thermal paper receipt. I carefully pulled it out and smoothed it out on the steering wheel. It was a highway toll receipt. The location printed at the top was clearly Concord, a small town about 30 miles north of Charlotte. I checked the timestamp. It was 7:30 that morning, just 2 hours before Colin collapsed in his downtown office. I stared at the receipt, my heart thumping against my ribs. Why would my son, on the day his perfectly healthy heart supposedly gave out, drive to Concord in a panic with a hidden brass key? My engineering logic immediately connected the dots that Monica's arrogance had ignored. A man planning to die of natural causes does not secretly drive out of town at the crack of dawn. A cold, terrifying realization began to form in my chest, pushing the grief aside and replacing it with a deadly focus. My son didn't just pass away, he was silenced, and the woman who just threatened me in the hospital hallway knew exactly why. 3 days later, the Charlotte sky was a heavy, suffocating gray. I stood at the entrance of the largest, most ostentatious cathedral downtown. This didn't feel like a place of mourning, it felt like a corporate mixer. The massive oak doors were open, and the foyer was packed with people who seemed more interested in exchanging business cards than expressing sincere condolences. Colin had built a logistics empire from scratch, and this crowd was a sea of tailored suits, expensive watches, and speculative smiles. I walked down the long center aisle, standing straight, my face ashen. I was the father of the deceased, the man who had taught Colin how to solder his first circuit board at the kitchen table when he was 10. However, when I reached the front row of pews, a young usher with a hidden earpiece blocked my path. He checked a laminated seating chart on his clipboard and pointed me toward the 4th row. Not the front row for the family, but the 4th row, firmly sandwiched between mid-level managers and distant corporate acquaintances. I didn't argue. I just went to my seat and observed. This was my field anyway. Engineering is essentially the science of observing structural flaws before a massive steel structure collapses. Monica had choreographed every detail of this event. She lingered in front of the altar, draped in a perfectly tailored black dress that looked more suited for a high-fashion show than a funeral. She was greeting the logistics company's board members and major investors. I watched her gracefully accept their condolences, dabbing her dry eyes with an exquisite black lace handkerchief. She played the role of the grieving widow with terrifying precision, but I heard the whispers around me. Monica had been very busy over the past few days, planting lies everywhere. A man sitting behind me leaned over to his colleague, muttering about how tragic it was that Colin had to deal with an estranged, aging father in his final months. He said Monica was an absolute saint for putting up with my alleged mental decline and erratic behavior. The script had already been written and distributed across the city. I was the disconnected, nursing, homebound relic. She was the brilliant, suffering wife, holding a massive empire together during a tragedy. The funeral began with a roar of the organ and a long procession of corporate executives. My eyes stayed locked on the polished mahogany casket at the front of the room. My child was in there. The pain in my chest was like a 1,000-pound weight, a crushing pressure that threatened to snap my ribs and force me to my knees. But I locked that grief away in a dark, quiet corner of my brain. Grief would only make me weak, and I couldn't afford weakness today. The room went silent as Monica took the stage at the massive marble lectern to deliver the eulogy. She adjusted the microphone and let out a soft, clearly rehearsed sigh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. She talked about Colin in a trembling, sing-song voice. She painted a vivid picture of a man who had worked himself into an early grave simply from the extreme pressure of managing a $50 million tech company. She told the silent audience that he hadn't been sleeping, and his heart had just given out under the massive pressure brought on by his own relentless ambition. It was a beautiful, completely plausible lie. She spoke of his grand vision, the legacy he left behind, and her commitment to lead the company forward in his memory, carrying the heavy burden on her own shoulders. The people below were completely mesmerized. Women wiped away tears, and men nodded with solemn, deep respect. It was an Oscar-caliber performance designed to solidify her power. But I wasn't watching the weeping audience. I was observing who she made eye contact with during the speech. Specifically, a man sitting in the front row, Trent Harrison. He was the company's CFO, a guy in his 30s with a slick-back hairstyle and the kind of expensive, flashy suits my son had always hated. The moment Monica tearfully made her final promise to protect the company's financial future, her gaze locked directly onto Trent. For less than a second, the mask of the grieving widow slipped. A hidden, triumphant, smug smile tugged at the corners of her perfectly painted lips. Trent responded to her dark gaze with an almost imperceptible nod. That wasn't the look of shared grief or deep loss. That was the look between two business partners who had just successfully executed a hostile takeover. The funeral ended with a standing ovation. For a funeral, it was an absurd and offensive gesture. But for the corporate showpiece Monica had orchestrated, it was perfect. I stayed in my seat as the massive crowd began to flow toward the spacious reception hall. I let the sea of dark suits wash past me, patiently waiting for the room to clear. I needed to move unnoticed. Being placed in the fourth row, dismissed by everyone as an ignorant old man, was my greatest advantage. No one would pay attention to a forgotten elderly relative. I walked slowly toward the side corridor of the cathedral, avoiding the main reception area where catering and an open bar were set up. Thick stone walls blocked out the noise from the crowd busy networking. I walked down a narrow, dimly lit hallway that led to a private preparation room used by the church staff. I stopped in my tracks when I heard the sharp click of Monica's signature designer heels coming around the corner, followed by a man's low, hurried voice. I pressed my back hard against the cold stone wall, holding my breath, stepping deep into the shadow of a massive marble pillar. It was Trent Harrison. He sounded extremely anxious, his voice lowered into a tense, harsh whisper that echoed in the quiet hall. "The board accepted everything," Trent said, his leather shoes pacing restlessly on the tile. "The transition of power will be seamless, but we still have one huge liability. Did you format his private server like I told you? We have to wipe it completely tonight." Monica let out a heavy, incredibly impatient sigh. Relax, Trent. Everything is under control. The server is completely offline. Being offline isn't enough, Monica. Trent pushed back, a note of genuine, undisguised panic in his tone. If someone gains access to those encrypted logs, we're both going to federal prison for a long, long time. You know better than anyone what's on that hard drive. We have to wipe it clean before that old man starts asking questions. He was staring right at us during the eulogy. Richard? Monica let out a cruel, mocking laugh that made my blood run cold. Richard is a broken, senile fool. He doesn't even know how to turn on a modern computer, let alone decrypt a secure logistics server. He's probably wandering around the parking lot right now, having forgotten where he parked his own car. I'll have the lawyers take care of him on Friday and kick him out for good. Just focus on the shareholder meeting. Make sure that server's scrubbed clean. Trent insisted, his voice trembling slightly. I don't want to take the fall for this. I stood perfectly still in the shadows. My fists clenched so tightly my knuckles ached. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together at a terrifying speed. The hidden, unmarked brass safety deposit box key in Colin's pocket. The panicked toll receipt from Concord. The deadly cold smirk they exchanged in front of the altar. And now, a private server hiding the key to massive illegal activity. They really thought I was just an outdated structural engineer. They really thought I was a senile old man blinded by grief. They had no idea that I'd spent 40 years calculating the precise load-bearing capacity of massive steel frames, searching for the exact structural weak point that would make them come crashing down. I waited in the darkness until their footsteps faded away toward the main reception hall. I didn't rush out to confront them. I didn't step out of the shadows to yell and demand answers for my son. That would only play into their stupid trap. Instead, I turned and walked out through the cathedral's side door. The humid air outside hit me, but I felt incredibly cold inside. My grief had crystallized into absolute, unwavering focus. Monica and Trent were eager to wipe away the digital traces of their profound betrayal. Incredibly confident, they were smarter than a dying man. But they had made a fatal calculation error. They severely underestimated a father who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. As I unlocked my car and sat in the driver's seat, I pulled the heavy brass key from my pocket. It glinted sharply in the dim afternoon light. A private server that needed to be wiped. A safe box waiting to be opened in Concord. The hunt officially had begun. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was a summons, not a polite request. It was an incredibly blunt, cold demand from a man named Derek, who introduced himself as the senior partner of a boutique corporate law firm downtown. He claimed to be in charge of my son's affairs and insisted that I come to his office immediately. I put on my best dark suit, the very one I wore to the funeral, and drove into the city center. Traffic was heavy, mirroring the heavy tension building inside my chest. Derek's office was on the top floor of a new, sleek glass high-rise. Walking inside, I noticed how devoid of life it was. It was an over-air-conditioned space, filled with modern abstract art, white walls, and sharp metal furniture. There was no warmth, no humanity, and no trace of human sympathy. It was perfectly set up as a place to package life-destroying lies in expensive leather folders. When the young receptionist ushered me into the main conference room, Monica was already sitting at the massive glass table. She looked unusually relaxed. She was casually sipping sparkling water from a heavy crystal glass. Sitting next to her was Derek, a man in his 30s wearing a custom Italian suit with a professional fake smile that seemed permanently glued to his face. "Richard, thank you for coming on such short notice," Derek opened, his voice smooth and highly refined. He pushed a thick stack of bound documents across the smooth glass table toward me. "We know this is an incredibly difficult time for the whole family. We are here to handle Colin's estate transfer as smoothly and painlessly as possible." I sat down slowly, my hands folded tightly on my lap. I didn't look at the stack of documents. I looked straight at Monica. She gave me a deep, compassionate frown, but the expression didn't touch her cold eyes. "I just want to honor his last wishes, Richard," she muttered softly, playing the role of the loyal, grieving widow to perfection. Derek cleared his throat, tapping the stack of fresh documents with his manicured index finger. "As you know, Colin updated his last will recently. specifically just 3 weeks ago. I felt a cold tightness grip my chest. 5 years ago, Colin and I sat down with my own lawyer, Thomas Mitchell, and meticulously established our respective trusts. Colin's estate planning was very clear and precise. Making a massive change to a will 3 weeks before a catastrophic heart attack wasn't just suspicious, it was impossible. A changed will? I asked, struggling to keep my voice flat and unreadable. My son never mentioned a word to me about this. Derek gave a condescending, overly patient smile, leaning forward across the table as if explaining a very simple concept to a slow child. Well, Richard, things in the corporate world move very fast. As Colin's logistics company grew, so did his corporate responsibilities. This new will leaves all of his assets, including his controlling interest in the tech company, various real estate properties, and liquid funds, completely and exclusively to his wife, Monica. I slowly lowered my gaze to the document. My name was completely wiped from the list of primary beneficiaries. According to these freshly printed sheets of paper, I had been systematically purged from the estate left by my only son. And what was his exact reason for this sudden change? I asked. Monica let out a highly theatrical, heavy sigh. She reached across the wide table, pretending to reach for my hand, but I pulled my hand away before her fingers could touch me. She retracted her arm gracefully, completely unfazed by my rejection. Colin was under immense pressure, Richard, she said, her voice dripping with synthetic, syrupy grief. The company was growing too fast. He was losing his mind under the daily stress. He started having these terrifying, paranoid episodes. He was convinced you were trying to usurp his board seat, convinced that you were secretly trying to take over the tech company. I stared at her, letting the absolute absurdity of her malicious lie wash over me. I am a retired structural engineer. I have absolutely no interest in running a logistics tech company. Colin knew this better than anyone on earth. We had sat on my back porch countless times, drinking beer and laughing about how little I understood his complex software algorithms. He thought I wanted to steal his company? I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet whisper. I am truly sorry, Richard, Monica whispered, looking at her manicured hands, feigning a tragic demeanor. He wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. His brilliant mind was slipping. I just wanted to honor his final paranoid wishes. This is what he truly wanted. Derek took over the conversation seamlessly, sliding a second sheet across the table, followed by a sleek silver fountain pen. To avoid any long, emotionally draining probate disputes, Monica is prepared to be incredibly generous today. She is offering you a formal settlement proposal. He placed a freshly printed bank check directly on top of that sheet of paper. $10,000, Richard. You just need to sign this simple waiver, acknowledging the full validity of this revised will, and permanently waive any future claims to the estate. $10,000. My son built a $50 million empire from scratch, and this woman wanted to buy my silence forever with an insulting $10,000 bribe. They were relying heavily on my grief. They expected me to be a broken, confused old man who would eagerly accept a pathetic, small severance fee to avoid a complex, long-drawn-out legal battle. They thought I would obediently sign my name on the dotted line, hand over my son's life work, and quietly fade into the background like a ghost. I looked down at the check, then at the waiver. My engineering brain instantly analyzed the structure of their trap. This was a classic ruthless pressure tactic. Strike when the target is at their weakest. Offer a quick, painless escape route to seize the legal high ground before the victim has time to psychologically recover. If I signed that paper now, Monica and Trent Harrison would have absolute, indisputable control over the company and any offshore accounts they had hidden. They would be completely immune to any future investigation. The boldness of the lie was staggering. Colin wasn't paranoid. Colin didn't lose his mind from work pressure. Colin had discovered their massive financial loophole. He had hidden a secure hard drive in a secret safe in Concord because he knew his own wife and his CFO were actively trying to destroy him. And when my son got too close to uncovering their massive theft, his perfectly healthy heart miraculously stopped beating. I slowly raised my hand and picked up the $10,000 check. Monica's eyes were locked on my movement, and a flicker of greedy anticipation flashed across her flawless face. She truly thought she had won. She firmly believed that this old man had finally stopped resisting and surrendered. I pinched the crisp, thick paper with my fingers, feeling the suffocating, heavy silence in the conference room. Then I made a smooth, deliberate movement. I tore the check straight in half. I carefully folded the two halves together, tore them again, and threw the useless scraps onto the smooth glass table. Monica's jaw instantly tightened. Derek leaned back in his expensive chair, the fake professional smile completely gone from his face. "I won't be signing anything today," I said, my voice carrying the hard, unyielding weight of cold steel. I stood up from the chair, completely ignoring their shocked, angry expressions. Before turning to walk out of the room, I deliberately leaned over the wide glass table, bringing my face close to the so-called revised will. I needed to see it clearly. I carefully examined the primary signature line on the last page of the document. When Colin was 12, he fell from a large oak tree and broke his wrist. Even though it was in a cast, the bone healed slightly off-center. Because of that childhood injury, Colin could never draw a perfectly horizontal straight line when writing. Every time he wrote the letter T in his name and drew that horizontal crossbar, his pen would naturally kick upward at a sharp, noticeable angle. It was a very unique, irrefutable quirk in his handwriting that only a father who watched him write would know. I stared at the deep blue ink printed on the thick paper. The name Colin Caldwell was written in bold and confident strokes, but the crossbar on the letter T was completely flat, as if drawn by a machine. There was no upward kick. There was absolutely no sign of his familiar childhood injury. I stood up straight and looked down at Monica. She was watching me closely, and a faint, nervous shadow of uncertainty finally flickered across her arrogant face. She had orchestrated a magnificent, cold-blooded corporate takeover, but she had missed one tiny yet fatal structural detail. The signature on this will is a complete forgery. I didn't say another word to Monica and her smooth lawyer as I left that glass table. I just turned my back on them, walked out of that cold office, and left the scraps of their pathetic bribe behind. I took the elevator down to the underground parking lot, listening to my own footsteps echoing emptily on the concrete in absolute silence. My brain was no longer covered by the heavy, suffocating fog of grief over losing my son. That fog had been completely burned away, replaced by a cold, incredibly sharp clarity. Monica had forged my son's signature on a legally binding document, completely ignoring the childhood wrist injury that defined his handwriting characteristics. She fabricated a paranoid delusion excuse to justify purging me from a $50 million estate. She successfully hijacked his funeral to solidify her corporate power, and she did it all while exchanging triumphant smirks with the company's CFO. I drove through the bustling streets of downtown Charlotte, my hands gripping the wheel, an incredibly quiet, deadly intense emotion permeating my inner being. The pieces of the puzzle were floating in the air, waiting for me to lock them into their precise structural position, waiting for me to build a definitive case that would absolutely convict her. On the way back to my ordinary single-story bungalow on the quiet suburban edge of the city, everything I did felt completely automatic. I pulled into the narrow driveway, turned off the engine, and just sat in the fading twilight. This house was the exact kind Monica despised the most. She had constantly pressured Colin to move me into a luxury high-rise apartment, calling my neighborhood outdated and depressing. She could never understand why a man who had built a comfortable life designing corporate buildings would prefer this simple, grounded life of brick and mortar with a front porch and a small patch of green grass. I unlocked the front door and walked in. The silence in the house was incredibly deep, made exceptionally heavy by my son's absence. Colin used to stop by every Sunday morning, bringing 2 black coffees and a box of hot bread, and sit by my kitchen island to chat about his week and his dreams. That daily life was gone forever. I walked slowly down the hallway, took off my dark suit jacket, and threw it casually over the back of a wooden dining chair, feeling the sharp drop in temperature in the empty room. My joints throbbed with extreme physical fatigue, a fatigue only a grieving parent can truly understand. But I couldn't rest now. My engineer's instinct was screaming at me, demanding that I analyze the structural flaws in Monica's perfect script. I walked into the kitchen, wanting to pour myself a glass of water. The late afternoon sun cast long, dark shadows on the linoleum floor, making the empty house feel even more desolate. When I reached for a glass in the upper cabinet, my gaze landed on a small desk cluttered with odds and ends in the corner of the kitchen. Next to a pile of organized mail sat my old, reliable landline phone. It was an outdated, bulky answering machine with a physical microcassette, a device that belonged entirely to another era. Monica had endlessly mocked me for keeping it. She always rolled her eyes and told Colin that I was hopelessly stuck in the past, completely incapable of adapting to modern technology or understanding the digital world. She insisted that everyone used digital voicemail and cell phones now. Now she was so incredibly confident in her technological superiority that she completely ignored the absolute reliability of old-school physical hardware. Right there in the dim light of my quiet kitchen, a small red light on the answering machine was blinking. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse. Blink, pause, blink. This indicated an unheard message. I frowned and set the empty glass down on the counter. This number rarely received calls anymore. Most were just automated sales calls or an occasional pharmacy reminder. I had only given this number to doctors, utility companies, and my son. Colin was the only person who called this landline frequently. He knew I preferred the clear audio quality over the unreliable cell networks. I walked to the desk, my heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet house. I leaned over and looked at the machine, pressing the small button to check the caller. ID and digital timestamp. The green digital display illuminated the dark corner of the kitchen. This call had come in at 2 a.m. on Tuesday. I stared at the glowing green digits, feeling my stomach take a sudden dive. That was the same night Colin passed away, just 5 hours before he supposedly collapsed with a massive heart attack in his downtown office. A chill crawled up my neck and stabbed deep into my spine. My son had called me in the middle of the night, hours before he died, and I had slept through the phone ringing. The guilt was like a sharp knife stabbing into my chest, a heavy remorse for not waking up when he needed me the most. But I pushed that feeling down hard, burying it under a wall of cold, analytical focus. I reached out with my index finger and pressed the huge mechanical play button on the machine. The microcassette began to run with a loud mechanical click. The speaker emitted a crackling static noise, mixed with a distorted, heavy background sound. It sounded like a car traveling at high speed on an empty highway. Wind roared into the open windows, accompanied by the massive roar of an engine being pushed to its absolute limit. Then a voice pierced through the thick static noise. It was Colin, but he didn't sound at all like the confident, brilliant CEO who led a $50 million tech empire. He sounded completely broken. His voice was raspy, desperate, and completely breathless. He was taking huge, labored breaths, speaking in a frantic, incredibly rushed whisper, as if he knew he only had a few seconds to speak. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the wooden desk so hard my knuckles turned white. I could hear extreme fear vibrating in my son's chest. He took one painful, sharp intake of breath, then struggled to squeeze out a few words. "Dad," Colin's voice crackled through the small plastic speaker, filled with absolute terror. "Dad, the pills." She switched the pills. "Go check the safety deposit box in Concord. They are draining the accounts." The recorded message cut off abruptly. But it didn't end with a simple click. It ended with a violent, chaotic crash of glass shattering into 1,000 pieces, followed by a wet, hair-raising gasp that sounded absolutely unlike anything a human could make. Then the line went dead. The answering machine gave a loud click, the cassette began to rewind, and my kitchen plunged back into deathly silence. I stood in the darkness, barely able to breathe. The truth hit me like a freight train with devastating force. My son didn't die of natural causes. Monica didn't just steal his money. She murdered him. The dawn light pierced through the blinds of the kitchen window, casting long, harsh shadows on the floor. I didn't sleep a minute. I sat in the darkness all night, replaying that chilling, distorted voice message over and over again, until the sound of my son struggling for his final few breaths was permanently etched into my memory. The initial paralyzing shock had completely dissipated, replaced by a cold, mechanical resolve. Monica and Trent thought they had wiped away the digital footprints of their massive financial crime. They thought erasing the private server would wipe out the undeniable proof of their embezzlement, fraud, and ultimate murder. But they forgot that physical servers are managed by people. And my son was a meticulous man. He would never trust any system without a hard physical backup. I had to break into my son's corporate office before Monica completely sanitized the workspace. I put on a comfortable but slightly worn pair of khaki trousers and a faded beige cardigan, deliberately selecting clothes that made me look weak, harmless, and completely out of touch with the modern world. I drove to the headquarters of Collin Logistics, a shining glass and steel building in downtown Charlotte. This building was a monument to his genius, proudly standing in the city's skyline. I parked and walked with slow steps toward the soaring glass entrance, letting my shoulders slump. I let my hands show a slight but noticeable tremor. I was about to perform the most important acting performance of my life. When I approached the front desk, the receptionist didn't even look up from the glowing display. I asked to see Monica, letting my voice tremble with an exaggerated sense of fragility. 10 minutes later, my daughter-in-law stepped out from behind a set of frosted glass double doors. She was wearing a sharp, charcoal gray designer suit, looking exactly like the newly crowned CEO. When she saw me standing there, looking both small and lost, a flicker of pure annoyance flashed across her face, but it was immediately replaced by an incredibly fake smile. "Richard," she said, her tone dripping with loud theatrical sympathy, clearly intended for the administrative staff around her. "What are you doing here? You should be at home resting." I blinked rapidly, looking around the spacious, modern lobby as if the bright lights were making me incredibly confused. "I just wanted a few photos," I stammered, ensuring my voice sounded sufficiently pathetic. "Monica, I was sitting at home and suddenly realized I didn't have that photo of Collin and me at his college graduation, the one he always kept on his desk. I just want to hold it. Please, I won't take more than a few minutes of your time." Monica sighed, taking a quick glance at her expensive gold watch. The subtle impatience in her eyes confirmed everything I needed to know. She viewed me as an absolute nuisance, a ghost that refused to dissipate. But refusing a grieving father's request for a simple photo in front of all her administrative staff would severely damage the saintly widow image she was carefully cultivating. "Of course, Richard," she said smoothly, placing a hand with a condescending gesture of charity on my shoulder. "You can go into his office, but please try to be quick. Trent and I have a very important board meeting to prepare for this afternoon. We're doing everything we can to keep Collin's incredible vision alive." She led me through a maze of stylish cubicles and open office spaces, proudly showcasing her absolute authority. When we reached Collin's massive corner office, she opened the heavy wooden door and pushed it open. The space inside was spotless, smelling faintly of citrus cleaner. They had already started packing his personal belongings into boxes. "Richard, I'll leave you here to reminisce slowly," she muttered softly, although her eyes scanned the entire room like a hawk. "Remember to close the door when you're done." She turned and walked away, her heels striking sharp clicks against the polished hardwood floor. The second the heavy door clicked shut, my entire posture changed instantly. The trembling in my hands vanished immediately, and my slumped shoulders straightened. I was no longer a confused, grieving old man. I was a chief engineer inside a hostile structure, searching for the critical weak point. I moved quickly and silently across the thick carpet, straight to Collin's massive, custom mahogany desk. The desktop was completely empty. Any useful documents or digital tablets had been cleaned out entirely. I knelt on one knee and checked the main drawers. The top 3 drawers slid open easily, empty except for a few scattered paper clips and pens. But the bottom drawer, the deep file cabinet, was firmly locked. I felt along the edge of the metal lock with my fingers. It was a standard commercial-grade pin tumbler lock. Monica probably thought the drawer contained nothing more than old tax records or meaningless business contracts, intended to be shredded later. But I knew my son. He always locked his most important information in the bottom drawer. I reached into the pocket of my faded cardigan and pulled out a small, heavy-duty steel tension wrench and a standard diamond pick. I'd had them hanging on my keychain for decades, a habit from my past days inspecting locked construction sites. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the lock, applying a very light, steady pressure with my left thumb. My right hand slid the diamond pick in, feeling the tiny brass pins inside. 1, 2, 3. I applied an incredibly slight upward force, listening carefully for the faint metallic click. My engineering background made this incredibly simple. A lock is nothing more than a mechanical puzzle relying on aligning friction. 4, 5. With the final satisfying crisp click, the lock cylinder turned cleanly. I pulled open the heavy drawer. My heart sank. The drawer was completely empty. No hidden ledgers, no encrypted hard drives, and no documents detailing offshore accounts. Monica and Trent had clearly been very thorough when sanitizing the office. They had taken whatever physical documents Colin had locked away. I squatted there, staring into the dark, empty space of the drawer, calculating my next step. The private server was wiped. The desk was empty too. But then a clear memory flashed through my mind. When Colin was a teenager, he used to assemble his own computers from scrap parts in our garage. He was incredibly protective of his work. Whenever he wrote very important code, he never left the backup disks in the machine. He used to use electrical tape to stick USB drives directly under the bottom of the desk drawer, because he knew no one would ever think to lie face up and reach into that narrow, dust-filled gap between the floor and the cabinet. It was a habit he'd kept throughout college. Slightly paranoid, but incredibly smart. I pressed my face against the carpet and reached my arm deep into the narrow, dark cavity beneath the bottom drawer shell. I stretched my fingers as far as I could, feeling the rough, unpolished wooden surface at the bottom of the desk. My fingertips brushed against something small, smooth, and wrapped in thick electrical tape. A strong rush of adrenaline flooded my bloodstream. I dug my fingernails into the thick tape and pulled hard. With a dull tearing sound, it came loose. I pulled my hand back into the light. Resting quietly in my palm was a sleek, black, military-grade encrypted USB drive. Colin had backed up that wiped server. He had left this digital map here, perfectly hidden in plain sight. I quickly shoved the small USB drive into the deepest part of my pocket, then pushed the bottom drawer shut, ensuring the pin tumbler lock clicked back into a secure position. Just as I stood up and brushed the lint off my knees, the heavy wooden office door was suddenly pushed open without any knock or warning. Trent Harrison stood in the doorway. He was wearing an expensive custom navy blue suit, holding a sleek digital tablet. His dark eyes locked onto me instantly, narrowing into slits, filled with intense calculating suspicion. He scanned the room, looking for any sign of disturbance, checking the alignment of the desk and the position of the chairs. "What are you doing on the floor, Richard?" Trent asked, his voice low and tight, filled with almost undisguised hostility. I switched back into my acting state seamlessly. I let my shoulders slump forward heavily. I widened my eyes and forced my hands to return to that fragile, pathetic tremor. I looked at him with a completely helpless and confused expression. "Oh, hello there," I stammered, my voice cracking at just the right moment. I dropped my reading glasses. I was just crawling on the floor trying to find them. Monica said I could come looking for a photo of my son. Have you seen the photo? The one of his graduation. I just can't remember where he put it. Trent stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. He was a cold corporate shark, but he didn't possess the eyes of a structural engineer who could see through deception. He looked at my faded cardigan, my trembling hands, and my completely bewildered expression. Slowly, the hard suspicion in his eyes melted into pure, arrogant contempt. He truly believed he was looking at a broken, senile old waste of space, who was absolutely no threat to his massive criminal empire. "There are no photos here anymore, Richard," Trent said coldly, stepping aside and pointing to the hallway. "You need to leave now. We have an executive company to run, and this is a restricted corporate floor." I nodded slowly, letting a pitiful tear gather in the corner of my eye. "I'm sorry," I whispered, dragging my clumsy feet as I walked past him. I just miss him so much. I'll get out of your way. Thank you for your time. I walked slowly down the long corporate hallway, perfectly playing the part of a defeated father, until I finally stepped into the elevator and the stainless steel doors closed completely. The moment I was alone, my trembling stopped entirely. I reached into my pocket and gripped the cold, hard plastic shell of the encrypted USB drive. Monica and Trent thought they had buried all the evidence. They thought they had successfully erased my son, but they had just handed me a weapon, one I would use to burn their entire stolen empire to the ground. I walked out of the shining corporate headquarters into the harsh afternoon sun of downtown Charlotte. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind me, sealing Trent Harrison and his soaring monument of lies inside. I kept my head down, maintaining the pathetic, dragging gait of a heartbroken man until I reached my car. Once inside, I locked the doors and finally allowed myself to take a deep breath. My fingers felt the hard, rectangular contour of the USB drive deep in my pocket. It felt like a live grenade. Colin knew his time was short, and he had left me the map to destroy them. I merged into the busy afternoon traffic, checking the rearview mirror constantly. Based on the conversation I'd overheard in the cathedral and everything I'd witnessed in that office, I had to assume they were watching me. Trent, while arrogant, wasn't a total fool. A man embezzling millions of dollars would naturally monitor the grieving father of the victim to ensure he remained docile and ignorant. I took the long way back to my block to confirm no vehicles were following me. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I had already formulated the crucial next step. If Monica believed I was an active threat, I wouldn't be able to investigate this financial crime. I needed to let them pop the champagne and celebrate their ultimate victory. A predator is at its most vulnerable the moment it believes the hunt is completely over. I walked into the quiet, empty house and locked the deadbolt. I walked straight to the kitchen desk, pulled the encrypted USB drive from my pocket, and placed it next to the brass safety deposit box key. They just sat quietly on the polished wood, the two pieces of ironclad proof my son had left behind in his desperate final days. I needed professional help to decrypt this USB drive and open the Concord safety deposit box. But using my landline or personal cell phone to make calls was too risky. Trent ran a massive tech company. His security team could easily pull my digital records. Before summoning my allies, I had to completely disarm the enemy. I needed to feed Monica a reasonable lie that fit perfectly into the script she had built for me. She wanted me weak. She wanted me to surrender. I decided to give her exactly what she wanted. I reached for my cell phone, took a deep breath, and pulled the weight of the grief back to the surface, letting it shatter my composure. I made my breathing short and irregular. When I dialed Monica's number, I was no longer the sharp structural engineer. I was just a tired, lonely, completely broken widower. The phone rang 3 times before she answered. "Richard," Monica said. Her tone was sharp, short, and dripping with undisguised irritation. She was sitting in a busy office. "I'm very busy right now. Did you find the photo and leave the building as Trent requested?" "Monica," I said, letting my voice crack pitifully. I let out a wet, heavy sob into the receiver, making it sound more pathetic. "Monica, I am so sorry. I am sorry for everything." The line went dead silent instantly. This sudden, absolute emotional breakdown clearly caught her off guard. "Richard, what are you talking about? Are you crying?" "I can't take it anymore," I whispered, deliberately holding the phone further away so my breathing sounded even more pathetic. I come back to this empty house, and the silence is just too heavy. Everywhere I look, I see Colin's shadow. "You were absolutely right in the lawyer's office." "Right about what?" she asked. The harsh irritation in her voice transformed into a cautious and urgent curiosity. "About the stress," I lied, letting a tear roll down my cheek to add weight to the performance. "I've lost my mind from grief. I don't want to fight over companies, board seats, or money anymore. None of this can bring my child back. I can't stay in this city one more day." I heard a faint but clear rustling of paper on her end, followed by the soft click of a door closing. She had walked into a private room. "What are you saying, Richard?" "I'm packing my things," I said, my voice trembling violently. "I called an old friend in a retirement community in Florida. He has a quiet room that's available immediately. Tomorrow, I'll sign over the property deed to a real estate agent and drive south. I just want to spend the rest of my life in peace. You and Trent can take over the company. You can have the entire estate." There was a long, meaningful pause on the phone. She was digesting this final victory. I could vividly imagine the triumphant smirk spreading across her face. This annoying old man was voluntarily exiling himself to a nursing home 1,000 miles away. "Oh, Richard," Monica cooed in a sickeningly sweet voice, "I think that is an incredibly healthy, wise decision. Starting over in the Florida sunshine is exactly what you need to heal right now. Don't worry about anything in Charlotte. Trent and I will manage Colin's estate perfectly. You just focus on packing your bags." "Thank you," I whimpered. "Thank you for understanding. I won't bother you again." I hung up the phone and threw it onto the counter. My trembling stopped instantly. The fake tears dried on my face, leaving behind a cold, terrifying resolve. My face turned to absolute stone. Monica must be popping the champagne right now, convinced she had won the war. She would drop all legal defenses, stop monitoring me, and then proceed to bleed my son's company dry without any concern. She had just given a man seeking revenge the greatest advantage one could ask for: absolute invisibility. I didn't walk to the bedroom to pack for Florida. I didn't get out any suitcases, and I didn't call a real estate agent. Instead, I walked to the hallway closet, reached for the top shelf, and took out a small, dusty cardboard box. Inside the box was a cheap prepaid burner phone I had bought for an emergency years ago. I opened it and watched the digital screen light up. I didn't need to look up the phone numbers. I'd memorized them decades ago. I dialed the first number. It belonged to Thomas Mitchell, a loyal corporate lawyer who had served my engineering firm for 30 years. He was a shark in a custom suit, a man who hated corporate thieves. He answered on the second ring. "Thomas," I said, "I need your help. My son didn't die of a heart attack. His wife is executing a hostile takeover of a $50 million estate." "I'm listening, Richard," Thomas replied, his tone instantly switching to combat mode. "Where are we meeting?" "Give me an hour," I said. I immediately dialed the second number. This number belonged to Dexter Cole, a retired federal investigator who owed me a massive favor. "Dexter," I said when that rough voice answered, "I have a military-grade encrypted USB drive, an unmarked brass key, and an address in Concord. I need you to bring your tools." "You got it, old friend," Dexter replied. I hung up the burner phone and looked at the brass safety deposit box key on the kitchen table. Monica thought she was dealing with a broken old man just looking for a quiet retirement. She had no idea what she had just unleashed. The wolf was beginning to hunt. Dexter Cole arrived at my house exactly 40 minutes after I finished making my calls. He parked his dark sedan in my driveway, displaying the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent his entire career operating in the shadows. Dexter was a retired federal investigator. More than a decade ago, I had helped him solve a serious structural contracting problem. He looked like a heavyweight boxer with extremely short gray hair, sharp eyes, and an intimidating presence in every movement. I grabbed the encrypted USB drive, the crumpled toll receipt, and the unmarked brass key. When I slid into his passenger seat, Dexter didn't offer any empty, useless condolences. He just saw the firm resolve in my clenched jaw, and he shifted directly into gear. We got onto the interstate and headed north toward Concord, leaving Charlotte behind. The drive took over 40 minutes, and the silence inside the car was incredibly comfortable. I explained everything I had discovered over the past 3 days. I told him about the forged signature, the conversation I'd overheard in the cathedral, and the terrifying, breathless message Colin had left on my answering machine. Dexter listened intently, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He didn't interrupt. When I finished detailing the depth of their betrayal, he let out a low, heavy breath. He told me that in 30 years of investigating corporate fraud, he had seen how money could twist people into monsters. However, a wife calmly planning a massive cover-up while her husband lay dying reached a new level of sickening, cold-blooded depravity. He assured me we would dismantle their entire network, brick by brick. His absolute certainty gave me a new strength. I was a man actively dismantling a deadly conspiracy. The town of Concord was incredibly quiet, a sharp contrast to the bustling business district of downtown Charlotte. Dexter navigated the local streets expertly until we reached a secluded single-story brick building buried deep inside a lifeless industrial park. There were no obvious corporate logos and absolutely no signs indicating that massive wealth was stored inside. A brass plaque mounted next to the reinforced glass door simply read, Concord Secure Storage. It was exactly the kind of facility a man in desperate need of hiding highly sensitive items would use, incredibly secure and disconnected from the surveillance network. We stepped out of his car, and the warm evening wind immediately wrapped around us. I felt the brass key in my pocket burning heavy and cold. Dexter followed closely beside me, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the empty parking lot. He naturally retreated into the highly trained instincts of a federal investigator to ensure we weren't being followed. We walked through the heavy front door into an incredibly quiet, empty lobby. The walls were lined with polished steel, and a thick bulletproof glass separated the waiting area from the main security desk. As we approached the counter, an older man in a crisp blue security uniform looked up from his computer monitor. I walked forward and pulled the crumpled toll receipt and the heavy brass key from my pocket. I placed the brass key steadily on the cold metal counter, making a crisp, deliberate sound. I told the guard I needed to access a private safety deposit box urgently. He looked at the antique key, then looked up, examining my face with a blank, professional expression. He politely asked for the specific name officially registered on this highly secure account. My brain raced back decades to those long, bright, sunny afternoons when Colin and I would often fish in a remote lake near the state border. Back then, he was just a little boy, and we would often pretend we were famous adventurers hiding massive treasures. I looked straight into the guard's eyes, my voice unwavering, and reported the specific name Colin and I had once used as a secret code. I told him the name on the account was Arthur Pendleton. It was an incredibly obscure private code. It was something Monica would never know, care about, or even understand in a million years. The guard slowly typed this alias into his computer terminal. The agonizing silence in the lobby seemed to stretch infinitely. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock in the quiet room. If Colin had used a different alias in his extreme panic, or if Monica had already found this place, our investigation would have completely collapsed. Finally, the guard gave a brief nod of confirmation. He pulled a thick leather binder from under the security desk and politely requested to see my identification. I handed him my valid state driver's license. He examined it very carefully, meticulously comparing my aged face to the digital file on his computer screen. Then he passed a paper sign-in sheet through a narrow slot in the bulletproof glass. He told me that Arthur Pendleton had specifically listed Richard Caldwell as the account's only authorized secondary access contact. My brilliant son had perfectly planned for this moment. He knew I would eventually solve these clues. Dexter and I followed the guard through a heavy steel door that required complex biometric retinal scanning. We walked down a bright hallway lined with thousands of identical brushed steel safety deposit boxes. The air was incredibly cold, smelling faintly of metal polish. The guard stopped at the very end of the massive room, pointing to a small rectangular box. He inserted his master key into the left side of the complex locking mechanism, then stepped back. I walked forward, my hands trembling slightly, and inserted Colin's brass key into the right side. I slowly turned it, feeling the pins click into place inside. I pulled the drawer out and carried it into a private viewing room off the hallway. Dexter closed the heavy door, ensuring we were completely isolated from the outside world. I placed the metal box on the wooden table, took a calming breath, and pushed aside the grief. I pried open the metal lid. Inside were 3 incredibly important items. The first item was a thick, black leather-bound ledger. It was densely packed with handwritten numbers, complex offshore routing codes, and dates going back 2 full years. Colin had been manually tracking every fraudulent transfer Monica and Trent had pushed through his company. The second item was another physical military-grade encrypted hard drive, undoubtedly the ultimate digital backup of their massive criminal empire. But the third item was what made my blood freeze completely. It was a sealed small plastic pill bottle, clearly labeled with my son's name and indicating his specific heart medication dosage. I knew the small, powdery white pills he took daily for blood pressure, but the pills rattling around in this sealed bottle were absolutely not white. They were brightly colored, distinctly oval-shaped, and coated with a thick film. This safe didn't just contain financial evidence of their massive corporate theft. It contained the murder weapon they had used to cruelly end his young life. I carefully picked up the small plastic bottle from the metal box, feeling the horrifying weight of its implications pressing down on my chest. Dexter leaned over my shoulder, and when his sharp eyes caught the bright colors of the capsules inside, they narrowed. We didn't need medical degrees to understand what we were looking at. Monica had systematically replaced his vital blood pressure medication with something entirely different, a drug designed to trigger a catastrophic cardiac event while masking it as a natural tragedy. I placed the pill bottle, the ledger, and the hard drive into my canvas messenger bag. We retreated from the sterile vault in absolute deathly silence, walked past the heavily armed security desk, and never looked back. When we returned to the completely unmarked sedan, Concord's warm evening breeze hit us, but I only felt a deep, piercing chill seep into my marrow. We drove straight back to Charlotte, completely bypassing my house and the corporate headquarters. We headed straight for a secluded high-end hotel on the southern edge of the city. Thomas Mitchell had specifically booked a corner suite using a corporate alias to ensure absolute privacy. When Dexter knocked twice on that heavy hotel door, Thomas opened it immediately. My old lawyer had taken off his usual custom suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and his face wore a grim, battle-ready expression. He didn't waste time with meaningless pleasantries. He welcomed us inside and immediately engaged the deadbolt. Sitting at a massive mahogany dining table in the center of the suite was a young man surrounded by a pile of stunning high-performance laptops, intricate cables, and heavily modified server equipment. Thomas introduced him briefly as a white-hat hacker genius. Tonight, this young digital forensics expert had been hired specifically to deal with a catastrophic case of corporate espionage. He looked unassuming, wearing a faded hoodie, but his eyes glowed with analytical intelligence. I walked to the table and emptied my canvas bag. I placed the small black USB drive I had retrieved from under the desk, side by side with the heavy military-grade hard drive I had taken from the Concorde safety deposit box. I told the young expert that these hard drives contained the blueprint for a $50 million theft and the terrifying, absolute motive for the calculated murder of my only child. The young man didn't ask any questions. He just nodded, plugged the devices into a complex routing hub, and began typing at an incredibly frantic, dizzying speed. What followed was a 12-hour-long, incredibly agonizing marathon. The hotel suite turned into a claustrophobic, silent bunker, with the only sounds being the crisp clicking of keys and the low mechanical hum of cooling fans exhausting hot air from the overloaded processors. Dexter stood by the window, occasionally parting the thick blackout curtains to monitor the empty parking lot below. Thomas paced the room with endless focus. My loyal lawyer downed cup after bitter cup of black coffee, muttering complex legal clauses as he meticulously prepared the structural framework for a massive federal lawsuit. I sat motionless in an armchair in the corner, staring fixedly at the small plastic pill bottle on the table. My brain slipped into a dark, terrifying loop. I pictured Colin alone in his office, a tightness in his chest, his originally healthy heart beginning to fail, him reaching desperately for the phone to call me, while the unknown poison his wife had fed him was systematically destroying his body from within. I channeled that huge, crushing pain into pure, undiluted focus. I wouldn't let exhaustion defeat me tonight. I would stay awake until I saw the faces of the monsters who had destroyed my family, mapped out in the cold, hard data. As the deep black of night slowly gave way to the pale gray light of morning, the tension in the room grew increasingly intense. The encryption on the military hard drive was incredibly complex, deliberately designed so that if an unauthorized external intrusion software program input too many wrong algorithmic keys, the drive would permanently self-destruct. The young expert was drenched in sweat, his fingers flying across multiple glowing screens as he ran local brute force attacks and complex digital decryption protocols. At exactly 7 a.m., a crisp, loud digital chime echoed in the quiet hotel suite. The hacker leaned back in his chair, let out a long, heavy breath, and wiped the accumulated sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. He turned the main display toward the center of the room. The complex encryption had finally been completely shattered. The digital vault doors swung open. Thomas, Dexter, and I immediately crowded around the glowing screen, viewing the truth that had been stolen. Our eyes scanned the endless lines of meticulous digital records Colin had compiled before his sudden death. Files were opened one by one, revealing a hair-raising but perfectly clear picture of absolute corporate betrayal. It was a massive, carefully covered-up trail of offshore wire transfers. Monica and Trent Harrison hadn't just stolen a little money to fund a luxury lifestyle. They had been executing a brilliant and systematic bloodletting of the company's most vital, liquid assets. Detailed spreadsheets showed dozens of virtual accounts, complex routing numbers, and highly secure banking protocols designed to bypass standard corporate oversight. They had covered their tracks with master-level precision during critical financial reviews, deliberately deceiving the internal audit committee. The data showed that they had deliberately built a network of untraceable shell companies deep in the Cayman Islands. They had used forged vendor invoices, severely inflated logistics consulting fees, and completely fabricated software licensing agreements to funnel massive amounts of money directly out of Charlotte. I watched the specific numbers roll across the glowing display, tracing the illegal transfers over the past 2 full years. Every month, like a ticking clock, another huge chunk of funds disappeared from the main corporate ledger, routed through 3 different international banks, and finally came to rest in their secret, secure offshore accounts. They had been slowly and methodically draining the blood from his logistics company, all while smiling in his face. The total amount of stolen funds was staggering. The hacker pulled up the final summary spreadsheet, highlighting the total amount in bold, bright red text. $15 million. They had stolen $15 million in 24 months, severely weakening the company's operational expansion ability and forcing Colin to work day and night to save the enterprise he loved. The massive pressure Colin had been under, the pressure Monica had so convincingly blamed for his mental decline, was entirely manufactured by her insatiable personal greed. My son didn't lose his mind. He was desperately trying to stop a catastrophic financial hemorrhage orchestrated by the woman he married. And when he finally discovered the truth, when he collected undeniable evidence and placed it in a secret safe in Concord, they knew they were completely out of time. They knew Colin would go straight to federal authorities and put them both in prison for decades. They had to act quickly, ruthlessly, and without mercy. Thomas Mitchell leaned over the table, his eyes tracing the offshore routing numbers. He let out a low, dangerous growl. He pointed to the specific date of the last massive wire transfer. They stopped dead 3 weeks ago. That was exactly when Monica claimed Colin suddenly decided to revise his final will and wipe my name off it. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a devastating, undeniable clarity. The forged will wasn't just a greedy additional move. It was the terrifying core of their entire master plan. They realized that stealing $15 million was very dangerous, leaving behind a massive digital footprint that might eventually be found by an aggressive corporate auditor. But if Colin suddenly died, and Monica inherited the entire $50 million company as the only undisputed beneficiary, then the theft became irrelevant. As the new CEO, she could easily write off the $15 million in missing funds as standard operational losses, burying the fraud forever. The forged will was their final move to steal the remaining $50 million without any interference from a grieving father. They wanted to seize the entire empire for themselves. The truth echoed in the heavy hotel suite with the solemnity of a vow forged by the undeniable evidence of my son's murder. Thomas gave an incredibly sharp, decisive nod, his legal brain already constructing the precise sequence of injunctions and federal subpoenas needed to freeze Monica's corporate accounts. Dexter simply crossed his thick arms over his chest, his posture radiating the quiet and dangerous stillness of a veteran hunter after locking onto his prey. But before Thomas could outline our direct tactical strategy, the young digital forensics expert raised his hand, his fingers hovering above the glowing keyboard, his eyes scanning a string of complex digital code cascading like a waterfall on a secondary display. He told us he had discovered something else. The massive financial ledger wasn't the only thing hidden in the military hard drive. Deeply buried under the cover of a completely different algorithmic lock was a secondary partition. It was a single large file, deliberately isolated from the offshore wire transfer records. The hacker explained that this specific partition didn't use standard corporate security protocols for encryption. It was protected by a unique biometric digital key, a highly personalized code that must have been manually programmed by Colin himself. The young man typed at an incredibly dizzying speed, running the remaining decrypted data fragments through a rapid sequencing program to break through this secondary barrier. The hotel room plunged back into a suffocating, unbearable silence. The low hum of the cooling fans seemed to vibrate directly inside my chest. I stared fixedly at the central display, my hands gripping the back of a wooden dining chair so hard it made my aged joints ache with pain. The minutes felt like hours. Then the black screen flashed brightly. A progress bar appeared quickly, filling from left to right as complex software finally shattered the secondary barrier. The digital vault groaned open, revealing a lonely video file in the dark directory. The name of that file was simply Richard. My heart slammed against my ribs like it had been hit with a sledgehammer. Thomas stepped back, giving me plenty of space, his intuition understanding the profound significance of what we were about to witness. The young hacker clicked the mouse slowly and opened the hidden video. The media player launched, and harsh, raw light filled the massive display, followed by my son suddenly appearing there. Seeing Colin alive on the screen, breathing and moving, felt like a serrated knife twisting violently in my stomach. The video was clearly shot in his private corporate office in the middle of the night. The only lighting was the harsh, pale light from his desk lamp. The digital timestamp in the corner showed it was recorded exactly 48 hours before his heart finally stopped beating. But the man facing the camera lens was not the vibrant corporate executive. Colin looked absolutely terrifying. He was drenched in a heavy, unnatural sweat, and his skin had a pale, sickly gray cast. Deep hollows were carved beneath his desperate eyes. His breathing was visibly incredibly short and heavy, his chest rising in chaotic, irregular rhythms. He looked like a man standing on the edge of the abyss, fighting a doomed battle with his own failing body. He leaned toward the lens, his hands trembling violently, gripping the edge of the mahogany desk to steady his swaying, frail body. "Dad," Colin whispered, his voice incredibly raspy, laced with deep exhaustion and absolute terror. "I hope you never have to watch this video. I hope I can hand this hard drive to federal authorities myself tomorrow morning. But my heart is beating too fast, Dad. It's been pounding against my ribs for 3 full days, and I just can't get it to slow down. I can't sleep. I can't breathe. I'm shaking. I thought it was just the stress of managing the logistics company. I thought the pressure of expansion was finally going to crush me. But Monica has been monitoring me closely since last week. Every time I take my blood pressure pills, she's right there watching me. She insists on pouring the water herself. She insists on handing the pills to me. I don't want to believe it. I don't want to believe that my own wife would do something so incredibly evil. But I finally took a look inside the bottle today, Dad. The capsules are different. I think she's been feeding me large doses of amphetamines. I think she's deliberately trying to trigger a massive cardiac arrest to mask everything she's done. Colin paused, closing his tired eyes tightly. A sudden, violent spasm of pain was visibly pulsing through his chest. He took a long, trembling breath, forcing himself to open his eyes, forcing himself to endure the pain to record the truth. "I found the offshore accounts, Dad," he continued, his voice dropping to a hard, hateful tone. "Monica and Trent Harrison. They've been draining the company's corporate accounts for 2 years. They set up fake vendors in the Cayman Islands. They stole $15 million right under my nose. Trent manipulated the internal audit, and Monica handled the executive authorizations. I was completely blind to it. I trusted them with my entire life, and they used my signature to cover their massive theft. I've spent the past 3 weeks quietly compiling every fraudulent transaction, every forged invoice, every illegal wire transfer. All the undeniable conclusive evidence is in this hard drive. But they know I'm closing in. Trent locked me out of the main server this afternoon. Monica's monitoring my every move. They know I have the ledger. They know they're going to prison. And they know my specific heart condition makes me incredibly vulnerable." My son looked straight at me. The sheer, naked fear in his eyes completely shattered my soul. He knew he was dying. He knew the lethal cocktail of synthetic drugs running through his veins was systemically destroying his fragile heart. "I can feel my weak pulse racing, Dad," Colin whispered, raising a trembling hand to his chest. "I'm so dizzy. I tried to leave the building, but Trent had the security team monitor the private elevator. I'm trapped on the executive floor. I'm going to wait until they leave tonight, then hide the hard drive. I'm going to hide this hard drive under my desk and put the physical ledger in the Concord safety deposit box. I have to hide the evidence before my heart fails. I know Monica will try to take the company. I know she'll fabricate some terrifying lie about my mental state. She started planting those seeds months ago, telling the board I was paranoid and delusional. She's setting the stage, just waiting for me to die, so she can immediately steal the remaining $50 million. She thinks she calculated every variable and won a total victory. But she underestimated me, Dad, Colin said, a sudden spark of engineering-like fanatical resistance appearing in his dying eyes that we shared as father and son. She thought I was just a fool who trusted everyone, but I saw her looking through my private files yesterday. I knew she would try to forge a revised will to kick you out and seize absolute control of the estate. I can't let her win. I can't let her take the empire we built. Colin reached outside the camera frame. When his hand reappeared, he was steadily holding a stack of freshly printed, thick legal documents bound in a blue folder. He held the documents up to the light of the bright desk lamp. The camera clearly captured a highly unique, complex holographic seal printed directly on the first page. It was a federal digital watermark, a guarantee of absolute, undeniable legal authenticity. "I had my private lawyer draft these documents yesterday morning," Colin explained, his breathing becoming more labored and desperate. "It was registered directly with the state probate court and digitally locked in the federal registry. It will completely overturn any fraudulent trash Monica might try to present after I'm gone forever. Dad, if you're watching this video, it means I didn't make it to the FBI. This is my true, legally binding final will. I leave everything to you. The logistics company, liquid assets, offshore properties, everything. Don't let her win. Don't let them take what's left of my life and steal my heart's work." The video suddenly faded into absolute darkness. My eyes were completely dry, and my heart was filled with a terrifying, absolute, and completely invincible cold steel resolve. As the black screen reflected my rigid, iron-like posture, the silence in the hotel suite stretched infinitely, turning into a suffocating eternity. Thomas clicked his laptop shut, breaking the spell that had held us trapped. Dexter walked away from the window. No words were needed. Our target was no longer a simple case of corporate fraud. This was a war for revenge that had to be waged. We collected the physical evidence, placing the thick leather ledger, the decrypted military-grade hard drive, and the private toxicology report into my canvas bag. We left the hotel room before the morning traffic started to congest, with the urgency and absolute precision of soldiers heading to the front lines. Thomas had already made a few necessary calls. We didn't go to the local police precinct. We were heading straight to the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. As the city of Charlotte just awakened, we drove into the high-security underground parking lot of the federal building. Thomas bypassed the standard visitor checkpoint, flashed his high-level attorney credentials, and took us directly into a soundproof conference room without windows. Waiting for us at the long metal table were 4 people. 2 were experienced federal agents, wearing crisp, dark suits, with faces deliberately kept neutral. Sitting next to them was a regional district attorney, a sharp, intimidating woman named Sarah Jenkins, known for aggressively prosecuting high-level corporate crime. Dexter greeted one of the agents with a firm, familiar handshake, silently conveying a signal. I am a person who absolutely needs to be taken seriously. I sat at the head of the cold metal table and placed my canvas bag directly in the center. I first pushed the thick leather ledger across the smooth table. I began to speak in the calm, methodical tone an engineer uses when outlining a catastrophic structural collapse. I explained the offshore wire transfers, the virtual accounts in the Cayman Islands, and the forged vendor invoices. I handed over the decrypted hard drive, explaining that it contained the complete digital footprint of a $15 million embezzlement scheme masterminded by Trent Harrison and my daughter-in-law. The agents plugged the hard drive into their secure terminal. When they scrolled through the undeniable data Colin had compiled while dying, their originally detached attitude vanished instantly. The district attorney leaned forward, her eyes narrowing sharply when she realized just how massive the scale of the corporate theft was in front of her. But the financial bloodletting was just the foundation of their absolute depravity. I reached into the bag and took out the fresh white folder containing the private toxicology report Dexter had obtained just hours before. I slid it across the table toward the district attorney. I watched her open the file, her gaze rapidly scanning the complex chemical analysis and the terrifying final conclusion. I explained that Monica had systematically replaced my son's vital blood pressure pills with an entirely different substance. She deliberately created a lethal chemical cocktail designed to guarantee his fragile heart would overload and trigger a massive cardiac arrest that would be impossible to trace. The room went dead silent. The agents stopped looking at the glowing computer screens and turned their full attention to me. The severity of intentional murder hung over the table like a 1,000-pound weight. Then I delivered the final devastating blow. I asked the digital expert to play the hidden video file we had extracted from the secondary encrypted partition. The massive display on the far wall lit up, casting pale light onto the faces of the federal agents. In absolute deathly silence, they watched my son, sweating and dying, look straight into the camera lens and detail the entire process of his own murder. They listened to his short, heavy breathing, heard him explain the forged documents, the millions of dollars stolen, and this most lethal betrayal. They watched him hold up his truly legally binding final will, stamped with the unmistakable federal digital watermark. When the video finally faded to pure black, not a single person in that soundproof conference room moved a muscle. The emotional impact was incredibly heavy, but I just sat there, my face carved from solid granite, without a flicker of emotion. The lead federal agent stood up, his jaw clenched tightly. He looked at the district attorney, signaling that they now had enough undeniable, reasonable cause to act immediately. He wanted to dispatch tactical teams to Monica's mansion and Trent Harrison's corporate office right now. He wanted to apprehend them both before lunch, freeze their assets, and seal the entire logistics company to protect the crime scene. He outlined a fast, aggressive strike plan aimed at hitting them before they realized their digital fortress had been completely breached. The district attorney nodded in agreement, reaching for her phone to authorize the arrest warrants and initiate the massive process of seizing the $50 million corporate empire. I raised my hand, laying it flat on the cold metal table. I told them to stop. The federal agent frowned, clearly confused by my sudden interruption. I looked straight at the district attorney and said that carrying out arrests at their homes this morning was nowhere near enough. If we took them down at this moment, Trent would immediately deploy his army of expensive corporate lawyers. He would claim he knew nothing about the offshore accounts. Monica would continue to play the grieving widow, insisting she knew nothing about the poison or the millions of dollars missing. They would drag the federal court into a multi-year, endless, and incredibly agonizing legal quagmire, blaming all the financial discrepancies on my dead son. I refused to let them hide behind a high wall built of expensive legal fog. I wanted them to suffer the consequences of their actions in public. I leaned forward, my gaze locked onto the district attorney. "We need to wait 24 hours, I told her. "Tomorrow afternoon, Monica and Trent are hosting an emergency board meeting at headquarters. They've summoned every major shareholder, executive director, and primary regional investor. Monica plans to present the forged will there and officially crown herself as the new CEO. She plans to liquidate the remaining assets under the guise of restructuring and permanently wipe out the missing $15 million. We need to let her commit this ultimate act of fraud with her own hands in front of those highly credible witnesses." The district attorney put her phone down, and a calculating smile spread across her face. She completely understood the brilliance of this delay. By officially submitting the forged will to the board, Monica would commit massive, undeniable federal wire fraud, corporate perjury, and grand larceny in broad daylight. We spent the rest of the morning meticulously planning every second of that emergency meeting. We coordinated the precise timing of the tactical strike, ensuring that the moment I gave the signal, all exits would be completely sealed. Monica believed she had orchestrated a perfect corporate takeover. She believed she was unbreakable, protected by the lies she'd spun, and the perfect narrative of the sudden heart attack. She firmly believed that the broken old man had obediently fled to Florida, allowing her to smoothly become the queen of this $50 million empire. Tomorrow I intended to let her walk into that boardroom with confidence. I would let her smile, take the stage, and climb to the highest step of the throne she had stolen. And then I would kick that ladder completely away. By the time the next afternoon arrived, a heavy, oppressive heat wave was radiating through the soaring glass windows of the corporate headquarters. In the sleek glass-walled boardroom on the 50th floor, overlooking the entire Charlotte skyline, an artificially manufactured atmosphere of grief and serenity had been perfectly choreographed. The air conditioning emitted a low, steady hum, cooling the spacious room to a clinical, bone-chilling temperature. Monica stood at the very head of that massive, polished oak table. She was wearing a perfectly tailored, jet-black designer suit, projecting both the image of mourning and absolute authority. Her posture was stiff but perfect, and her makeup was completely flawless. Standing beside her was Trent Harrison. He was wearing a deep navy blue suit jacket, his arms crossed over his chest, his face wearing an extremely confident, predatory smirk. He didn't even bother to hide this smirk from the executives, major shareholders, regional investors, and senior executive directors gathered around the wide table. They were powerful and intelligent people in the business world. Yet, at this moment, they sat there in absolute, respectful silence, completely mesmerized by the Holy Widow act Monica was staging. She held a fresh, white tissue in her left hand, dabbing gently at the corners of her dry eyes. Her voice trembled with carefully practiced grief as she spoke of tragically and suddenly losing a brilliant husband. She spoke of his relentless passion, his sleepless nights, and his beautiful vision for the future of this tech empire he'd built from the ground up. She painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture of a man who had worked his heart to absolute collapse simply because of his work. This emotional manipulation was masterful, and it was sickening. She was using the absolute tragedy of his death, this death she had carefully orchestrated with a bottle of lethal amphetamines, as a stepping stone to absolute power in the company. Trent nodded solemnly as she spoke, playing the role of a focused, loyal corporate confidant to perfection. He was stepping up to guide this grieving widow through the complex legal transition of Colin's $50 million estate. "I know Colin would want us to move forward," Monica said, her voice dropping to a brave, quiet whisper that echoed softly in the silent boardroom. "He poured his entire soul into this company. He sacrificed everything to see it succeed. In the final weeks of his life, as the pressure started to cloud his brilliant mind, he realized he needed to protect this legacy at all costs. He wanted to ensure that the vision we built together would never be jeopardized by external interference or inattentive leadership." Trent stepped forward and placed a thick leather-bound folder directly in the center of the polished oak table. He opened the heavy cover, revealing the freshly printed legal documents with the blatantly forged signature. "This is the reason we are gathered here today," Trent announced, his voice emitting a smooth, majestic baritone, "to honor the last legally recorded wishes of our founder. As you all know, Colin updated his final will recently, naming his wife as the sole beneficiary and absolute controlling shareholder of this logistics enterprise. Today we must formally approve the immediate liquidation of certain restricted assets and formally transfer administrative voting power to Monica. This will permanently stabilize our market position and assure our clients that the company's future is absolutely secure." The board members nodded solemnly in agreement, completely blind to the massive $15 million deficit hidden by expert-level routing in the Cayman Islands offshore accounts. They had no idea they were actively participating in the final phase of a massive and bloody heist. They were just eager to put the tragedy behind them and securely protect their own financial portfolios. They reached for their crystal water glasses, preparing to stamp their rubber seal on this massive transition of power and wealth. Monica reached across the table with elegant and calm movements. She picked up a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. She looked down at the final transfer document, the ultimate result of 2 years of systematic bloodletting and meticulously calculated poisoning. I could easily imagine the rush of triumphant pleasure surging through her veins. In just a few seconds, her signature would lock the stolen $50 million behind an impenetrable wall of corporate bureaucracy. She would permanently wipe out the missing funds, cover her tracks, and then walk away as an incredibly wealthy, untouchable queen. She lowered the sharp gold nib, pointing it toward the thick dotted signature line at the very bottom of that fresh white paper. She hovered just fractions of an inch away from her ultimate victory. At that very moment, I kicked the ladder completely away. The heavy, solid oak double doors of the glass-walled boardroom didn't just open. They swung inward with a sudden, violent force, sounding like a physical explosion slamming into the interior walls. The massive, aggressive impact echoed like gunfire, instantly shattering the quiet, respectful silence of the executive meeting. Every head around the massive table turned in absolute collective shock toward the entrance. I walked into the room, my footsteps heavy and rhythmic on the polished hardwood floor, radiating a completely unyielding majesty. I was no longer wearing the faded beige cardigan or soft khaki trousers. I had completely shed the pathetic, trembling camouflage of the broken, confused, senile widower. I was wearing a tailored charcoal black suit, my shoulders pulled back and my spine straight. I summoned every ounce of strength from the cold, commanding structural engineer who had dominated corporate boardrooms and destroyed countless corrupt contractors for decades. My face was carved from cold, hard granite, and my eyes stayed locked onto Monica, radiating a silent yet hair-raising promise, that of absolute destruction. I didn't walk in alone. Standing to my left was Thomas Mitchell, my incredibly loyal lawyer. He was clutching a heavy black leather briefcase filled with the decrypted offshore ledgers, private toxicology reports, and digital video files that were about to end her life. Standing to my right and following quickly behind us into the room were 4 grim-faced federal agents. They were wearing matching dark suits, silver badges prominently displayed, their hands cautiously resting near their utility belts. They spread out with skilled military precision, immediately sealing the main exit and securing the perimeter of the executive meeting space. The fountain pen slipped from Monica's fingers, making a huge clattering sound on the polished oak table and leaving a dark, jagged ink smear across the forged document. The fake, grieving smile she'd maintained for the past 20 minutes froze completely on her flawless face. As she stared at the federal agents sealing the room, her bright eyes suddenly opened wide with absolute terror. She looked at my dark suit, my steady hands, and the cold, unblinking anger in my eyes, finally realizing that the fragile, confused old man she thought she had easily manipulated had just orchestrated a massive, deadly trap. The vibrant blood drained rapidly from her once flawless cheeks, making her look like a hollow, terrified ghost. Trent Harrison took a step back in sheer panic. When he quickly noticed the silver federal badges blocking his only escape route, his previous arrogance evaporated instantly. The trapped wolves suddenly realized, in that incredibly short, agonizing moment, that they had been completely surrounded. The impending destruction was so immense, it completely paralyzed Monica. Then her survival instinct kicked in, manifesting as pure, unadulterated hysteria. Monica slammed her manicured hands down onto the polished oak table, her voice cracking into an incredibly sharp, piercing scream that echoed violently off the thick glass walls. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, loudly demanding that the building's security staff immediately throw this senile, paranoid old fool out of her corporate boardroom. She screamed that I was having a severe mental breakdown, that I was a grieving, pathetic father who had completely lost touch with reality and was desperately trying to destroy her husband's beautiful legacy. Trent Harrison quickly stepped forward, his face flushed red from panic-induced adrenaline, loudly insisting that federal agents did not have the legal jurisdiction to interrupt a private executive shareholder meeting. He demanded to see the arrest warrants immediately, his voice dripping with a fake, desperate authority that convinced absolutely no one in the room. The board members just stared in stunned, breathless silence, completely paralyzed by the absolute chaos that had suddenly erupted. I completely ignored all their crazy, pathetic screaming. I didn't blink, and I absolutely did not break my cold stare. I walked slowly and calmly to the very center of that massive table, the sharp click of my leather shoes cutting through the insane noise they were making. I stopped directly across from Monica. I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out the heavy-duty, military-grade hard drive. I held it high above the table, letting the bright overhead lights illuminate its brushed metal shell, and then slammed it down onto the polished oak surface with a deafening thud. The sudden, violent impact made Monica instinctively jump back, her breath catching in her throat. I looked straight into her terrified eyes and told her that this particular hard drive contained the complete, unencrypted offshore financial ledger. I told her it contained specific routing numbers, virtual vendor accounts in the Cayman Islands, and undeniable proof that she and Trent had systematically stolen $15 million from my son over the past full 24 months. Trent Harrison let out a choked, gasping breath. His knees visibly buckled as the absolute reality of their miserable situation crashed down on him. He knew the digital forensics trail was impossible to deny. The flow of huge missing funds could be traced. International IP addresses could be verified, and the digital signature would point directly to his own computer terminal. However, Monica completely refused to surrender with dignity. She stubbornly held onto her final, desperate lie. She frantically claimed that Colin himself authorized the transfers, saying he was the one who hid the funds from company auditors, and that her recently updated will gave her absolute legal rights to deal with the financial consequences. That was when Thomas Mitchell stepped forward, his custom suit jacket pushed back, his posture radiating the deadly confidence of an experienced litigator preparing to deliver a killing blow to a hostile witness. He placed his heavy black leather briefcase on the table, right next to the hard drive. With the fluid, skilled efficiency of a master, Thomas unlatched the brass locks and pulled out a stack of thick, fresh, securely bound legal documents in a bright blue folder. He held the papers up high, allowing everyone in the conference room to see clearly. The bright overhead lights perfectly illuminated the highly unique, complex holographic seal stamped directly on the front page. Thomas announced to the silent, mesmerized board that what he held in his hand was the true, legally binding final will of Colin Caldwell. He explained calmly, his voice echoing in the room with absolute, unwavering authority. This specific document carried a permanent federal digital watermark. It was registered directly with the state probate court and digitally locked in the Federal Registry just 48 hours before Collins suffered his lethal cardiac event. Thomas turned his sharp, calculating gaze toward Monica, his voice dropping to a cold, clinical level. He pointed out that this federal document completely superseded any fraudulent, unverified, and coincidentally timed revised will she might be trying to submit to this board today. The warm color drained completely from Monica's pale face, making her look like a hollow, terrified phantom. Her perfectly constructed reality was crumbling into ashes before her eyes. She reached out, her fingers trembling violently, wanting to snatch the blue folder. But the hair-raising presence of the federal agents kept her frozen in place. Thomas cleared his throat, pushed up his reading glasses, opened the blue folder, and turned to the main declaration page. He began reading the document aloud, his voice steady and relentless. He read Collins' meticulously drafted word-for-word legal terms, which were incredibly sharp and devastating. Collin explicitly stated that due to the discovery of massive financial fraud, serious corporate embezzlement, and profound personal betrayal, he was formally, completely, and permanently disinheriting his wife. Thomas read the specific punitive clauses, revoking all of Monica's administrative privileges, canceling her access to any corporate bank accounts, and stripping her of all marital assets related to this logistics empire. As these accusations hung over the room with the weight of a crushing blow, the wealthy board members exchanged eyes wide with extreme shock. They were witnessing the absolute destruction of the incumbent CEO in the very moment before she could officially ascend to the throne. Shareholders began to whisper, a rising tide of awakening and absolute condemnation aimed directly at the woman trembling at the head of the polished oak table. Then Thomas read the final and most crucial paragraph of this certified document, his voice raised significantly to ensure that everyone in the massive room could hear the absolute finality of Collins' decision. He read, 100% of the equity of this $50 million company, all outstanding liquid assets, all offshore properties, and all administrative voting power are immediately and irrevocably transferred in full to his father, Richard Caldwell. I stared fixedly at Monica, watching these undeniable words strike her like a series of cruel physical blows. Her mouth hung open, but absolutely no sound could come out of her throat. Her knees trembled violently beneath her designer skirt, and then she collapsed heavily into the high-backed leather chair behind her, her manicured hands gripping the wooden armrests in pure, unadulterated shock. She looked around the spacious boardroom, desperately searching for even a single friendly face that could offer her a sliver of comfort. Her gaze met those powerful and intelligent corporate elites she had been so desperate to impress and manipulate, the wealthy investors she had planned to please with stolen money. She saw their expressions rapidly shift from mourning to absolute disgusted horror. They now knew exactly what she had done. 4 stern federal agents took a large step toward the table. Heavy steel handcuffs made a soft metallic clinking sound, breaking the heavy silence in the room. Monica realized that she had just lost everything forever in front of Charlotte's corporate elite. For a brief moment, the only sound in the massive boardroom was the ticking of the clock. Then the reality of the destruction broke through Monica's paralyzing shock. She sprang from the leather chair, her hands gripping the edge of the oak table so hard her knuckles turned white. Her voice tore through the quiet room in an incredibly sharp, piercing scream of absolute denial. She pointed a trembling finger at Thomas Mitchell, screaming that the document he held was a complete forgery. She frantically accused us of faking the federal watermark and conspiring to steal her legitimate inheritance. She demanded the board ignore this pathetic old fool and the actors he'd hired, shouting for the security team to throw us out immediately. She turned her pleading gaze to Trent Harrison, silently begging her criminal accomplice to step forward and use his corporate authority to confirm her crazy lie. She expected him to summon his slick arrogance and call building security to forcibly evict us, as he always did. But Trent didn't move to help her. His confident smirk had vanished, replaced by the face of a man sweating with extreme panic and deathly pale. He suddenly realized he was standing on the gallows, and the trap door beneath his feet was about to open. Trent didn't look at Monica. His terrified eyes stayed fixed on the canvas bag sitting in the center of the table. He recognized the thick leather ledger sitting there. He clearly saw the military-grade hard drive, the very drive he had personally tried to format from the company's server just days ago to cover his tracks. But more importantly, he saw the lead federal agent confidently step forward, holding up a clear plastic evidence bag to the bright light. Sealed in that bag was the prescription pill bottle with Colin's name, sitting right next to the federally certified toxicology report. Trent was a calculated, cynical corporate predator, and his survival instinct was incredibly sharp under extreme pressure. He instantly digested the overwhelming volume of physical and digital evidence laid out before them today. He instinctively knew that the decrypted digital ledger had crossed the boundary of any reasonable doubt, legally confirming the massive $15 million embezzlement. He knew the hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were completely exposed to federal scrutiny. And looking at that pill bottle, he finally realized that the sudden heart attack they had engineered was now officially classified as a premeditated, meticulously documented murder. The trap had slammed shut. Trent understood that now there was absolutely no legal means, no expensive defense lawyer, and no corporate loophole that could save the rest of his life from a maximum security federal prison. In a desperate attempt to save himself from total destruction, Trent immediately did the only thing every coward cornered by undeniable truth would do. He spun around, betraying the woman standing next to him. Trent raised his hands into the air, backing away from Monica, as if she had suddenly contracted a highly infectious, lethal disease. He looked straight at the lead federal investigator, his voice trembling with a sickening mixture of rising panic and an urgent desire to comply immediately. He pointed his index finger straight at Monica's chest, and the words that would nail her to the cross of shame poured out, like a hasty, frantic torrent of absolute betrayal. He loudly declared that the entire corporate embezzlement scheme was entirely her brilliant idea from the start. He frantically swore that he was only executing her administrative orders, simply trying to handle the severe financial consequences of her reckless, unrestrained corporate spending habits. But then he made the most terrifying final confession to the crowded room. He practically screamed that Colin's tragic death had absolutely nothing to do with him. He told the federal agents, in front of the entire stunned board, that she was the only one who had actively switched the pills. He loudly confessed that Monica had orchestrated the lethal dosage, ordered the synthetic amphetamines, and personally handed the lethal cocktail, successfully disguised as blood pressure medication, to Colin. He desperately offered to testify in full against her, completely abandoning their lethal partnership just to save his own pathetic skin. As Trent's cowardly words echoed in the quiet boardroom, Monica let out an incredibly raspy, wounded animal-like gasp. This final betrayal by her accomplice completely shattered what little composure she had left. The lead federal agent gave a sharp and decisive nod to his team, and the remaining 3 agents immediately acted with skilled and irresistible precision. They seized Trent first, pinning his arms behind his back without hesitation. Cold, heavy steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists, with a loud, satisfying metallic finish. They informed him that he was under immediate federal arrest for corporate embezzlement, international wire fraud, and accessory to first-degree murder. The other 2 agents flanked Monica. She tried to break free from their grip, her expensive designer suit twisting awkwardly as she struggled against their iron-hard, merciless hold. Heavy handcuffs snapped shut around her delicate wrists, pinning her arms behind her back. The lead agent read her the Miranda rights in a flat, monotone voice, which stood in incredibly sharp contrast to her rising hysterical and deafening panic. The wealthy board members watched in absolute stunned silence, witnessing the incumbent CEO of a $50 million empire being forcibly restrained, like an ordinary violent street criminal. The bright, polished facade she had carefully maintained for years vanished completely, replaced by the reality of her incredibly ugly, chaotic, and astronomical greed. The federal agents began to drag them both toward the heavy oak doors, preparing to haul them across the busy corporate lobby where the entire company would witness their shameful end. When the federal agents turned her toward the exit, preparing to begin her long and unavoidable journey of shame, Monica dug the heels of her designer shoes deep into the polished hardwood floor, desperately resisting the forward momentum. She twisted her neck in a final, agonizing effort to look back at me. The black streaks of running mascara had completely ruined her flawless makeup. Her icy, unbreakable arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by a pitiful, sobbing, desperate plea for mercy. She screamed my name, begging me to stop the heavily armed federal agents immediately. She insisted she loved Colin, said this was a terrible misunderstanding, and said we could still resolve this privately as a loving, normal family. She wailed that I couldn't just let them take her to a cold prison cell. I slowly walked around the edge of the massive wooden table and stopped a few inches in front of the woman who had once smiled at me while planning to bury my only son in the hard earth. I leaned close to her ear, ensuring my tone was low, steady, and cold-blooded. "You told me not to even think about getting a single cent of my son's money," I whispered, watching the last spark of desperate hope in her eyes extinguish completely. "You were right. I didn't get a cent. I took it all back. Enjoy your 20 years in a cage?" The swift and brutal collapse of Monica and Trent Harrison was a spectacular drama that dominated the headlines of Charlotte corporate news for months. Shortly after their high-profile arrest, the fragile criminal alliance they had built disintegrated rapidly. Faced with the weight of the decrypted offshore ledgers, the federal toxicology report, and my son's final video, they tore into each other like cornered beasts. Trent desperately tried to reach a plea bargain by providing an exhaustive confession, detailing exactly how Monica had systematically researched, obtained, and administered the lethal synthetic amphetamines. He provided the federal prosecutor with every digital footprint, every deleted email, and every hidden routing number. Monica fought back, unleashing a massive array of expensive defense lawyers, attempting to paint herself as a terrified, abused wife manipulated by a predatory corporate executive. The federal judge saw right through their pathetic and transparent lies. Because a massive amount of the stolen funds was still floating in the Cayman Islands, they were both deemed an extreme flight risk and denied bail. 6 months later, this long legal battle finally came to an absolute end. They were convicted of international wire fraud, grand larceny, corporate espionage, and first-degree premeditated murder. Currently, they are both incarcerated in separate maximum security federal prisons, facing the unavoidable reality that they will rot in concrete cages for the rest of their lives. Right now, I am sitting quietly behind the massive mahogany desk in the main executive office, looking out over the sprawling Charlotte skyline through floor-to-ceiling glass windows. This was Colin's sanctuary. He spent countless sleepless nights in this room, building his logistics empire, and this is the exact room where he bravely recorded his final statement. Over the past 6 months, I have officially taken over the board, walked out of my quiet retirement, and put on the mantle of CEO. My first executive action was a cold, uncompromising purge of the entire corporate architecture. I systematically fired every executive director, financial auditor, and regional manager who had actively facilitated Trent's embezzlement scheme or turned a blind eye to the violations. I completely dismantled the toxic corporate culture they had allowed to ferment, replacing the complicit board members with experienced and incredibly loyal industry veterans whom I had personally vetted. We have worked tirelessly to process the complex financial aftermath, recovering the $15 million stolen from the offshore accounts and aggressively stabilizing the company's fragile market position. Today, the logistics company is operating with incredibly precise, efficient effectiveness, and its foundation is absolutely secure. However, sitting in this luxurious office and controlling a massive $50 million empire hasn't brought me even a shred of personal joy. Without my son here to share it, massive wealth, corporate prestige, and vast industry power mean absolutely nothing to me. I am just an old man who is perfectly satisfied living a quiet, simple life in my modest house, tending to my garden, and enjoying my peaceful retirement. I only wished for my child to be safe, and knowing that his success made him a target is a heavy burden I will carry forever. But I refuse to let Colin's brilliant legacy be defined by his terrifyingly tragic death. I refuse to let the greed of two despicable parasites overshadow the incredible vision my son brought to this world. I reached across the wide mahogany desk and picked up my heavy gold fountain pen. Lying in front of me was a stack of thick, finally confirmed legal documents, meticulously drafted by Thomas Mitchell and his corporate legal team. I signed my name at the bottom of the last page, formally converting a large portion of this $50 million company into a permanent, well-funded charitable entity. I established the Colin Caldwell Incubator Foundation. This foundation is specifically aimed at providing massive, no-strings-attached financial grants, comprehensive structural resources, and elite-level legal protection to young tech engineers just starting out. I want to find the bright, ambitious kids who have brilliant ideas that could change the world, but lack the massive capital to protect themselves from predatory corporate investors. I want to offer them the kind of absolute, unbreakable safety net Colin had to fight with everything he had to build independently. The foundation will ensure that my son's name forever becomes synonymous with creation, innovation, and unwavering support, completely erasing the dark stain Monica and Trent tried to leave behind. His logistics company will continue to thrive, generating the necessary annual revenue to fund the incubator indefinitely. Long after I am gone, Colin's incredible ideas will continue to shape the future of this city. His legacy has been permanently protected against any future corruption or unchecked greed. Later that afternoon, I left the busy corporate headquarters and drove to a peaceful, serene cemetery on the eastern edge of the city. The warm spring sun shone brightly, casting long, soft shadows across the manicured green lawn. The air was filled with the fresh scent of pine and blooming jasmine, creating a sharp and comforting contrast to the lifeless, icy atmosphere of the federal courts and corporate boardrooms where I had spent the last half-year. I walked slowly along the familiar, winding flagstone path until I reached the place where Colin rests. The dark granite headstone is simple, elegant, and sturdy, perfectly reflecting what kind of a person he was. I stood in quiet solitude for a very long time, feeling the rustle of the wind through the old oak leaves. I absolutely did not cry. All the tears had run dry during those dark, terrifying nights when I first uncovered their shocking, deep betrayal. Now I only feel a deep, lasting peace. I reached into my trouser pocket and pulled out the heavy, unmarked brass key, the key that opened the Concord safe, the key that exposed the lethal prescription, the key that ultimately saved his life's work. I slowly knelt, a sigh escaping from my joints, which were slightly aching from age. I carefully placed the cold brass key directly onto the smooth granite base of the headstone. I brushed a fallen leaf off the spot where his name was carved, and touched those familiar letters with a steady hand. At that moment, I spoke to him aloud, my voice barely more than a whisper, drifting across the quiet lawn. I told him the logistics company was safe, his incredible vision was fully protected, and the monsters who had hurt him could never touch his legacy again. I stood back up, straightened my suit jacket, and took one last look at his grave. The deep burden of grief and revenge that had sustained me for the past 6 months began to slowly lift from my weary shoulders, replaced by a quiet, unbreakable pride. They saw a grieving father and assumed I was just a weak, confused old man waiting to slowly wither away. They mistook my retirement for a lack of strength, but they forgot a fundamental law of nature. A wolf may grow old, his fur may turn gray, and he may prefer the quiet of his den. But when you threaten his bloodline, you will quickly find that his teeth are still sharp as knives, and his bite is still deadly. The deepest lesson from these stories is that when something doesn't feel right, never ignore your intuition, especially when it involves the people you love most. Blind trust can sometimes create opportunities for greed and selfishness, leading to heartbreaking consequences. However, no matter how cruel the betrayal, the truth will eventually surface. By keeping a clear head and summoning the courage to face reality, we can protect ourselves and move forward with strength. If you found this story meaningful, please like and subscribe to this channel so you won't miss any upcoming videos. Have you experienced a similar situation? Feel free to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments section below. I would love to hear from you. Accompanied by gentle guitar music and singing, I used to ride on your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. When I looked at the world through your eyes, every path felt less uncertain. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. When the winter chill arrived, you would stand between them and me. Time flows on like a river, and you slide slowly toward that ocean. But no matter where life takes me, you are always a part of my life. I am my father's daughter, and every step I take, every time I choose to stand when it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, burning with your flame in my soul. Even as the years go by, your love still guides me home. You taught me that strength is not in power, but in kindness during difficult times. You taught me how to keep going when the road becomes cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh by the campfire echoes gently within me. When I face the hardest battles, when I feel I cannot hold on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, "Child, you are stronger than you think. I am my father's daughter, and every step I take, every time I choose to stand when it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, burning with your flame in my soul. Even as the years go by, your love still guides me home. Someday the snow will cover the tracks, and someday the fire will burn out. But what a father gives his daughter is something that never disappears. Not gold, not stories, not the battles he won, but the way he quietly loved her, and the person she eventually became. I am my father's daughter, and I always will be, regardless of every victory, every loss, regardless of every joy, every pain. The world may change around me, the stars above might dim, but I will always carry my Father's endless love. When they ask me who I am, I will smile and answer gently, I am my Father's daughter. I am my Father's child.